Hello and welcome to this JD Power webinar, Europe's Auto Forecast 2026, Technology, Policy and EV Adoption. I'm Tom Hooker, journalist for AutoVista24, part of JD Power, and I'll be your moderator today. Over the past year, one trend has become increasingly apparent. Europe's automotive industry is not converging towards a single EV future. Instead, national pathways are becoming distinct and ever more diverse. Today, we'll explore what that means in practical terms when planning for 2026 and beyond. On that note, I'd like to introduce today's panel. Christoph, maybe you could start us off. Let us know a little bit about yourself and what you're most excited to explore in this session.
Yeah, certainly, Tom. Hello, everyone. Yeah, very happy to be here and talking about the topic today. Yeah, I guess I would be most excited to hear about the nuances that we have across the regions in Europe when it comes to EV adoption.
Marco, I'll turn it over to you next.
Yeah, hello everyone. I am Marco Pasquetti and I'm responsible at JD Power for forecasting residual values of used cars for the Italian and Spanish market.
Hello everyone, I'm Midas Balt. I'm in charge of the Belgium and the Netherlands residual values at JD Power, and really thank you for joining us.
Good morning everybody from me. I'm Neil King. I'm the head of forecasting at EV Volumes, now part of JD Power.
Thanks everyone. So what can you expect then from this webinar? Well, firstly, we'll be looking at Europe's new car market outlook in 2026 and in the medium term. We'll then be exploring the factors behind this divergence, including policy, incentives, and country-specific differences. Following that, we'll review the upcoming technologies and new models that could reshape the market. And last but by no means least, we'll have our Q&A section. You can submit questions at any time using the Q&A box in the GoToWebinar platform. And if we don't have time to answer your questions during this session, then please don't worry, we'll be following up with you afterwards. You'll also be seeing this QR code throughout the webinar, which is currently on the left of your screen, and that will take you to autovista.com/explore. And it's packed with additional information, so be sure to check that out. And one final note, today's session is being recorded, and you'll be able to find that recording on the AutoVista24 YouTube channel. While we won't be sharing the slides from this webinar, there will be an article covering the main points over on autovista24.com. So let's begin with the forecast, and we'll start with a quick question and a quick poll for our audience. How do you expect new car registrations in Europe to perform in 2026? To have your say, please grab out your phone and use the QR code on screen or the link beneath it to go to our poll. There's option A, which is you expect a growth of over 2%. Option B is you predict a growth between 0 and 2%. Option C is you think there'll be a decline between 0 and 2%. And finally, you may even choose option D, which is you expect a decline of over 2%. So please grab out your phone, scan the QR code and get involved. Now, before we jump straight in, I think it's very important to set the scene for a second. Christoph, since our last New Car Outlook webinar and this one, what have been the most impactful changes for automotive registration forecasts from your perspective?
Yeah, so if we look at economies, we can definitely say that things haven't looked fantastic when we had the last webinar. So economic outlooks were a little bit soft before. But this chart, which we're showing now, shows that these forecasts have come down further. On the left, you see the GDP growth for 2025, which was, as I said, not robust growth. It was pretty soft. So not a great year economically. And then you saw, and this is in the middle of the slide, you saw a small improvement of these forecasts for 2026. So a little bit of a recovery perspective was happening in the beginning of the year. But now we have this new conflict in the Middle East, which has driven energy prices up. It has driven inflation up. It is stressing supply chains. And you can see in the latest forecast on the right side, this is from March 2026, that basically everything has come down. Yeah, so that's where we stand economically, and that's not good news for vehicle registrations in 2026. And there's another topic which I wanted to raise. If we move on to the next slide, this is a change in the EU's regulation, which is currently still under negotiation, so it hasn't been ratified, but it's likely that it will be ratified. And it's a softening, of the zero emission regulation, which will definitely impact adoption of electric vehicles in Europe, in the EU, possibly in the UK. We'll hear later a little bit from Neil about that. Yeah, but this is definitely on the EU level. The 3 points I wanted to raise on this chart, I've circled for you. So instead of the 100% reduction in CO2 tailpipe emissions, we're now down to 90% reduction. And yes, there is a offsetting required, but it's a de facto reversal from the internal combustion engine ban. Another point here, super credits for small EVs. So keep that in mind. There may be more and more smaller EVs being pushed by OEMs into the market to get access to these super credits, which will help you for compliance. And yeah, and the last point on the bottom, for LCV, the 50% reduction has been reduced to 40 because it was just unrealistic, too pushy to reach 50. So they are suggesting to push this down to 40% reduction.
So the important question then, how have these developments changed Europe's new car market outlook? Now, before we jump into that, let's see what the audience has to say. And it's a pretty even vote. 40% of you said that we expect a growth between 0 and 2%. 28% said there would be a decline between 0 and 2%. And we're still seeing some last votes come in, but we can see there 23% said they expect a growth of over 2%. So Neil, I'll hand this over to you now. Firstly, are you surprised by this? And secondly, does this differ from your most recent forecasts?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I mean, fundamentally, that poll result confirms my suspicion. I think the core point to note is that there's been a change from, let's say, being in the growth over 2% zone to now being in, as you can quite clearly see here, I'm revealing the result that our latest forecast foresees only 0.1% growth, and that's total light vehicle sales in Europe. For new cars specifically, we've downgraded for forecast. We're only looking at about 0.2% growth now. That's compared to a forecast of 1.7% growth in December. And for LCVs, the downgrade has been a bit more dramatic, whereby we're now foreseeing a modest decline of about 0.5%, but that is compared to what was previously a growth of 3.4%. I mean, fundamentally, as Christoph already outlined, the economic was not significantly different for this year, but we've already seen volatility, especially in oil and gas prices. And of course, the escalating tensions pose greater risks of long-term risks to inflation, interest rates in particular. I mean, what I would say is, like everybody, it is far too early to assess the let's say the long and medium-term repercussions of events. But we have naturally assumed short-term weakness and fundamentally lower structural demand. The couple of extra points I would make is that if you think back about a year when the trade tariffs were unleashed, LCV demand actually fell first and harder. Businesses are, let's say, more immediately affected by this level of uncertainty on uncertainty, hence why we've got a slightly more dramatic decline on, or dramatic, let's say, revision to the LCV forecast. And final point, as I've mentioned, as you can see quite clearly here on the slide, we've built in declines in the European light vehicle market in 2030 and 2035. Not surprisingly, this is all connected to the more stringent emissions targets, whereby we predict a bit of a, let's say, a pull forward effect in 2029 and 2034, and then obviously payback in 2030 and 35 when the new targets are rolled out.
And of course, another factor we have to consider here is the European Commission's automotive package. So how has this changed the outlook, especially if we're just looking from 2035 to 2040?
So, I mean, fundamentally, you know, the key change, as you mentioned there, Tom, of course, is that, you know, car makers can now sell hybrids, plug-in hybrids, even ICE, as in pure petrol diesel vehicles beyond 2035, with, you know, the removal of the de facto ICE ban. What I wanted to do on this slide really was just, you know, highlight, as you can see here, what the changes are. Now, between 2025 and 2029, there's no change. 2030 to 34, slightly less strict target for LCVs, but the key change again is after 2035, whereby we no longer have essentially a 0 grams emissions target. We have 12 grams for cars and 16 for LCVs. The core point I wanted to make on this, though, really is if you know, translate this into, let's say, a requisite BEV share to achieve compliance, we're looking at about 50% share of passenger vehicles need to be BEVs in the period 2030 to 2034. The only change being, of course, now that compliance can be averaged over years 2030 to 2032. But by the time you fast forward to 2035, we estimate that you're looking at needing about 85% BEV share. Now, that is, you know, obviously incredibly challenging for passenger vehicles, but for LCVs, I would suggest that there was probably be a policy review coming. I mean, they reduced it slightly for 2030 to 34, but that to me seems pretty unachievable already for LCVs, but only time will tell.
Certainly only time will tell. Well, given what you and Christoph have said so far, I would presume that BEVs have been the most affected in your updated forecasts. Firstly, is this correct? And secondly, have you noticed any other interesting patterns or trends going on for other powertrains?
Yes, Tom. I mean, you know, obviously the BEV share has been revised, but by, let's say, revising our growth assumptions for BEVs, by default, we have increased the market share for other powertrains. Now, crucially, again, hybrid, PHEV, ICE sales can now happen beyond 2035. But with that in mind, I think the point I really wanted to make was that this, let's say, stay of execution for many powertrain types paves the way for development of more hybrid vehicles. That we've seen examples of that in terms of recent announcements from Volkswagen and Stellantis. But crucially, of course, it also paves the way for Chinese OEMs to bring more plug-in hybrids and even their infamous EREVs, extended range electric vehicles, into Europe. My general view was, obviously, with no ability to sell those vehicles after 2035, there wouldn't be a massive push in what is, in automotive terms, a relatively short time frame. But that has all changed. The final point on this I would make is, so if you look at the dotted line, that is our, let's say, calculated BEV share that is required to achieve compliance with the latest emissions targets. Now, as you can see here, we're generally okay. We're hitting them certainly as an average between 25 and 27, and again between 2030 and 32. But by the time you get to 2035, we face a real challenge with that, 85% BEV share required. And bear in mind, in the current proposals, the super credits for small EVs, the M1E category that Christoph alluded to earlier, they at the moment will disappear at the end of 2034. So cut a long story short, they will no longer save the day. and hence why we don't foresee emissions compliance in 2035, and I can envisage more policy changes on the way.
And we usually have quite a large audience from the UK in our webinars as well, Neil. How has that market been affected by recent developments compared to the EU?
Yeah, I mean, not surprisingly, the UK is as affected. Many would argue even more affected, given our energy sourcing approach. But you know, by recent events, particularly rising oil and gas prices. So you know, we have, in terms of the overall market, naturally reflected the same sort of short-term weakness. You know, the Bank of England held interest rates, but they themselves warned that a new wave of inflation is on its way. So some sort of foreboding words already there. But as with in terms of, let's say, powertrains and emissions targets and policy, again, you can see here, you know, we have a clear ZEV, zero emission vehicle mandate in the UK, and I've superimposed that over our latest forecast. And again, you can see essentially just a divergence of the BEV share forecast and the ZEV mandate. And ultimately, I think, Tom, you'll confirm this. I believe you actually even wrote an article on this on AutoVista 24 recently. But I can certainly envisage UK policy being reviewed. The government is already coming under increasing pressure as it is. And I suspect that the UK will ultimately remove their own de facto ban on ICE sales from 2030, and they will also then permit hybrids, possibly even ICE, as in pure petrol diesel vehicles, after 2035.
Well, interesting stuff then. I think it's safe to say, whether it's the UK or the EU, overall direction in Europe is going the same way, but the pace and distribution do differ by market. In the next section, we're going to be giving a bit more context around these numbers and the underlying root causes. That includes policy, incentives, and country-specific differences. Just before we do that, though, a reminder that you can submit your questions to our Q&A, and I can already see that we're getting some fantastic questions being sent in. So let's look then at this diverging BEV adoption in a bit more detail, because many are still puzzled as to why there are these huge differences. Marco, please enlighten us. What is driving these substantial discrepancies?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. European markets are progressing at very different speeds in the transition to electric mobility. Some countries like Sweden, Finland, and the Netherlands already show high EV shares, while others such as Spain, Italy, and Poland are still in the early stages. Norway is a clear outlier, having reached an exceptional 98%. These differences aren't driven by a single factor, but I would say that it's a combination of structural elements. And I would like to talk about Italy as an example. In the next slide, I'm comparing Italy with the European average and the Netherlands to show how structural factors affect EV adoption. The first challenge is infrastructure. Italy is not that bad with the number of public chargers if we look at them in absolute terms. But when you look at how many chargers there are per car, the picture is completely different. Italy, for example, has only 0.7 public chargers every 1,000 vehicles, while the Netherlands is at 12.7. So the real question isn't how many chargers do we have, but is the network ready for future demand? Then the second factor is home charging, and Italy has a very high share of people living in flats, 59% versus 48 average in the European Union, which means fewer private parking spots and fewer chances to charge at home. Meanwhile, countries with a higher EV penetration usually have more off-street parking and cheaper, easier home charging options. And finally, income plays a big role. Italy is below the European average, and lower purchasing power naturally pushes people toward cheaper models, which slows down the switch to EVs that have been more expensive than traditional combustion engine models so far.
So we've just explored then some of the reasons and factors why EV adoption is lagging in some European markets. But Idesvald, are there any other factors we can point to for markets with a higher EV adoption?
Yes, thank you, Tom. Picking on Marco's points, we could identify, in fact, 8 key drivers for the BEV journey. Anyhow, each of those are worth their own webinar, you know. They are very often overlooked or even completely forgotten in the BEV adoption. Let's say the first one, the culture and history. As an old marine power with Protestant Calvinist roots, purchasing decisions are made on a mainly transaction basis in the Netherlands, prioritizing total cost of ownership and tax efficiency. People tend to lease rather than to buy. In the Netherlands, for instance, 2/3 of the new car sales are for business use, what we are calling the zakelijk rijden. Nearly 80% of the BEV is business owned. The result is that brand and technology loyalty is also minimum, and the swap is immediate, responding to any change in taxation. An example is a small change in the BEV taxation recently in 2026 has led each EV growing by more than 30% since January, while the BEV then plumbed by more than 6%. Another interesting topic is the awareness about the environment. In the country, like in the Netherlands, where 26% of the land lies below sea level, even -7 meters, citizens and industry are sold to long-term measures to protect and preserve the environment. This includes, of course, replacing those internal combustion engines with alternative solutions, such as electrical power. In the next slide, we will highlight politics and taxation. Adoption of new technology, and especially the BEV, requires a very stable policy framework with limited cross-party coalition, defining rules with predictable steps equally for all types of customers on a very long term. In the Netherlands, for instance, Mark Rutte served as Prime Minister for 40 consecutive years. And the last point is also natural resources. Of course, any country rich in natural resources, like gas and electricity, can rely on a solid operation, budget, and is also shielded from volatility in commodity prices. In the Netherlands, until 2023, Netherlands could exploit Europe's larger gas reserve in Groningen.
And one of the points you touched on there was how stable policy and long-term policy supports this EV adoption. But I wonder, do the way in which these policies are structured and the time frame that they're implemented in actually change adoption rates? Idesvald, which path would you recommend governments take with this one?
I will not recommend anything to a government anyway, but at the end, what we can see and say is that adoption of BEV is a very long, challenging journey. Here we have identified, in fact, 5 maturity levels of from the very early ages of the BEV to reach a level of critical mass and then beyond that. Each type of incentive and policy finds its proper place at a specific stage of maturity in a step-by-step approach. We won't go, of course, not going in every piece of detail, but we will have a quick look on the different levels. The very first level, BEV is totally unknown. Early adopters are influencers. BEV have any running cost at all. They have free parking, free charging. Then the second step is building the market and the ecosystem stone by stone. The name of the game, of course, is empowering the company adoption rate by very low or zero taxation. At the third level, we have an increasing BEV adoption to reach that critical mass. where incentives then are more focusing on the infrastructure and the industry maturation. The fourth level is adoption of BEV has surpassed the ICE vehicles. We have reached a critical mass even for both and private customers and usage. And thus, any incentives are elected to focus on zero emission vehicles just to meet the CO2 targets. And our last level, the private consumers and the companies are driving BEVs, and they're also driving zero emission vehicles. So other measures then needs to be taken to offset this and to ensure financial inflow for the states, this for both used and new vehicles. The last example of that is the new proposal made in the Netherlands called the e-time rule proposal, is in fact to support used BEVs. You know, in the Netherlands, we have one thing which is a taxation on a new car, which is the BPM based on the new car price and the CO2. And we have the baretelling. The baretelling is the fringe benefit taxation, to make it very simple. But the proposal aimed what is that vehicles older than 5 years will be no longer taxed based on the new car price, which is very high on BEVs, but on the real market value of those vehicles.
Well, clearly then a wide range of policies can support EV adoption. But Marco, as these EVs become more mature, do we notice a difference in the effectiveness of purchase incentives versus tax incentives?
Yeah. Yes, Tom. Over the past 2 years, purchase incentives have shown a short-term impact on EV market share in Italy, but their effect fades very quickly. In June 2024, for example, incentives generated a sharp rise, but the market returned to normal just a month later. Moreover, since the incentives were announced 6 months earlier, sales had previously fallen because customers were waiting for the incentives to be implemented. And in 2025, this decline didn't happen, but implementation again produced a strong temporary boost followed by a rapid normalization. So overall, this pattern shows that purchase incentives can stimulate demand briefly, but they do not deliver lasting effects. Well, in the next slide, instead, we can see the long-term impact of a tax incentive introduced in January 2025. This measure changed the taxation rules for company cars and gave an advantage to plug-in hybrids over traditional combustion models. Before this change, up to the end of 2024, the market share of plug-in hybrids, as we can see, was basically stable between 3 and 4%. Starting from January 2025, the share began to grow steadily, increasing by around 6 percentage points within a year. That is, in the end, it's a rise comparable to the one we saw in the previous slide, but it's stable in time. So the key difference is that purchase incentives are more of a tactical move because they give the market a quick push, while tax incentives work as a long-term strategy that shapes the market over time.
And maybe this is a difficult question for you now, Neil, but how are you integrating all of these changes in the incentives landscape into your forecasts?
Yeah, thanks for that, Tom. Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, obviously, we consider all the national policies, incentives, tax changes, and let's say overlay those over obviously the core EU emissions targets, for example. But I mean, in the case of Italy, you do have this sort of a holdback effect ahead of incentives rolling out. But as we've seen, the incentives themselves, funding tends to run out after a day. So not surprisingly, we're not too dramatic with the impact on our forecast. Whereas if you look at markets like the Germany, even the US, you know, when incentives ended, obviously there's quite a dramatic change. In the case of US, we knew it was coming. But in the case of Germany, although there was speculation that incentives would be removed, when it actually happened, it was quite unannounced. And you also see that in consumer behavior, of course. They can't hold off if they don't know something is coming. So, but I mean, you know, it can affect obviously the powertrain mix, but it can also have an impact on total market demand. And we factor all of those in as best we can at a national level to build up to our big European and global picture.
Thanks for that, Neil. And of course, alongside all of these factors that we've mentioned already, a wave of new technologies and EV model launches also has the potential to rewrite forecasts. Now, just before we get into that though, it's a final reminder that you can submit your questions to our Q&A, which is coming up shortly. Now, as Christoph mentioned at the start of this webinar, we may soon see a defined small EV category in Europe. Marco, do you see particular opportunities for these vehicles in markets where smaller segment cars are sought after and purchasing power is maybe lower than in other parts of Europe?
Yes, Tom. In this graph, we can clearly see that smaller vehicle segments accounts for around 60% of the Italian market, and this is a pattern stable over time. This preference is partially driven by lower purchasing power, but also by parking habits, because Italians must rely on street parking, as we saw before. And the size of the car becomes, in this case, a key factor in the purchase decision. If we consider the number of available models in 2020, electric options in the smaller segments were still quite limited compared to other powertrains. But today, the situation has changed significantly because the range of electric models in these segments has now increased. And this is good news, because this means that manufacturers are now focusing on the segments that are most relevant for the Italian market. Moreover, it's important to highlight in the next slide that prices are decreasing for small electric cars. And in the A segment, prices have clearly started to decline over the past few years. And the consequence is that now affordable models reached an interesting market share in Italy. While in the B segment, the price drop for electric models is less pronounced, but overall prices have also been reducing since around 2024. Looking ahead, my opinion is that a broader availability of smaller electric cars will likely support demand even for higher segments.
Now, alongside these smaller, more affordable EVs, there's also been lots of discussion around Chinese brands expanding in Europe. Christoph, are these newcomers actually influencing competitive dynamics and forecast assumptions in the continent? And are some countries seeing stronger impacts than others?
So the Chinese origin brands, they are capturing quite a significant market share. On this slide, we're showing you how they have been growing market share in the BEV and FEV space, slightly more successful in the plug-in hybrid space because they have better technology on offer and more on offer in that space. But overall, around 10% market share. Now, they are very successful in markets like Italy, Spain, Poland, UK. With the exception of UK, the other three mentioned markets aren't the big volume markets for battery electric vehicles, but it still shows that they are successful, and so it's definitely something to watch and and reflect in the forecast. I already saw that a question came in. Can we forecast Chinese origin brands sales in the coming years? Definitely something a space to watch.
And Marco, we've talked about smaller EVs and Chinese brands, but I now want to ask you, what's the next wave of technological development that is likely to influence adoption and competitive positioning in Europe?
Yeah, well, Tom, the first technology I want to mention is the 800-volt platforms, which allow much faster charging. The idea is simple in this case. If we reduce waiting times, switching to an EV becomes far more appealing. Then we have a vehicle to grid. And this makes EVs an active part of the energy system, because when they are plugged in, they can give electricity back to the grid and help keep it stable. A related feature is a vehicle to load that lets the car power external devices like tools during an outage or equipment for outdoor activities and stuff like this. The fourth is plug and charge, which makes the charging experience much easier. The car identifies itself automatically at the charger, so you don't need apps, cards, or any extra steps. You just plug in and it starts charging. And finally, city plugs or curbside chargers. And these low power chargers installed on the street are crucial for people who live in apartments and has to rely on street parking. They make overnight charging possible in dense urban areas.
Well, the future certainly looks exciting then. I think that brings us on quite nicely to our Q&A section. We've had some great questions sent in, but please do keep posting them in. If we can't get to your question today, then don't worry, we'll be reaching out to you by email after the webinar. Now, I have the first question here for you, Idasbald. You've explained the reasons why EV adoption is higher in some countries, but in those countries, private EV demand still lags behind. Why is this?
This is really a hot topic, and we could discuss hours and hours on making drive a new webinar on this. I think what's outside the user-chooser issue and the leasing sector, we should never forget that the private consumers, the buying process is a second or the third largest expense the household budget can afford. So the major factor is risk on investment of the perception the people have. So people only buy what they know or they're already experienced with, and this is eyes. Furthermore, what we also forget is the vast majority of private buyers turn to used vehicles, for which today excess supply does not match at all that private demand. We have big cars, powerful cars, and the budget required for purchase those vehicles exceeds completely their financial needs. Obviously, the cost of using a new technology, and that we have already seen with HEVs, with LPG and so on, must truly offer a significant financial advantage to encourage the adoption of the new technology. Simple, we could say, if you want to change a consumer behavior, it's rather easy. But then you require really political courage, because you dig into the pockets of the user, or simply you elect some ban regulations.
And I've got one here for you now, Neil. What is the single biggest risk to your current 2030 to 2040 forecast assumptions?
In a word, policy. I mean, fundamentally, I mean, obviously, this latest forecast, we wrestled with whether we reflect the automotive package or not. I mean, it felt prudent to do so, and we would be amiss if we hadn't. But bear in mind, it hasn't been ratified yet. So, and I highlighted there sort of 3 examples of where I can envisage policy change: 1 in the UK, and 2 as far as LCVs and small EV super credits are concerned. So there will inevitably policy will change, but how much changes in the short term versus the long medium term remains to be seen. And we obviously adjust our forecasts accordingly based on policy changes.
And one for you that's just been sent off here, Christoph. What parallels do you think can be drawn between the Japanese car entering Europe between in the late 60s and the early 70s and the current boom of Chinese cars in Europe?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wasn't born in the late 60s, But definitely there have been instances like what we're seeing now with Chinese origin brands hitting Europe. We saw it with Korean origin brands, and as the question apparently states, that we also of course saw it with Japanese brands. I think it has paved the way, yeah, for European consumers to be more open, yeah, to new brands and new competition. Competition is usually good, yeah, for consumers, for technology, for advancements. I think what's different is the number of brands. Yeah, so I didn't say it before, but we have roughly 15 Chinese origin brands already active in Europe, and this will grow. The question is how many brands, you know, can sustain or can survive in Europe, and I think we're all looking to hear an answer to that in the coming years. But that's different, right? So we have way more competition coming from abroad than ever before.
Thanks, Christoph. And one now for you, Marco. Which currently low penetration market has the greatest potential to surprise with strong EV growth?
Yeah, yeah, this is interesting question, Tom. I would say that even though EV market share is still relatively low, probably I would choose Spain. And the reasons are because it's increasing year after year. Then there is a growing availability of more affordable models that will help to unlock the demand. And then the country is expected to make structural investments that should support a faster transition in the coming years, in my opinion.
If you don't mind, I'll just add to that quickly. I mean, we've seen the dramatic change in PHEV adoption in Italy, for example, driven by policy. But you know, strangely, you know, these are markets that are often overlooked. But there's been a lot of change in BEV adoption led by policy in the Baltic states, and that is partly related to, not exclusively, but let's say reducing reliance on Russian gas. And in turn, obviously, bolstering their electricity network. So, but beyond that, we've seen policy change in Poland, dramatically increase adoption there as well. So, again, fundamentally, any market could be our next, let's say, winner or, you know, rapid EV adopter if the policies are put in place. And it's not just taxation or incentives, but, you know, various measures are available, as both Marco and Idespelt have highlighted.
And Tom, on that same question, I think if we look at the big volume markets like France and Germany, which are not high penetration BEV markets, we may see some surprises there as well, right? Because if OEMs need to become compliant with CO2 emissions, they will have to look at the big volume markets for sure.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. I think, yeah, watch this space. It's going to be an interesting few years ahead. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for our Q&A. And in turn, that also means we're out of time for today's session. If you'd like to explore any of the products referenced today in more detail, then please do visit autovista.com/explore. And if you found this session insightful, be sure to sign up for our next webinar using the QR code to the left of your screen, where we'll be decoding the total cost of ownership, or TCO, landscape. And while you wait, use the QR code on the right of your screen to check out our previous webinars. A recording of this webinar, while we won't be showing the slides, will be available on the Autovista 24 YouTube channel. All that's left for me to say then is a big thank you to our panel for joining me today. And of course, a big thank you to you, the audience, for joining us, getting involved with the poll and submitting so many thoughtful questions. We hope to see you in our next webinar, but it's goodbye for now.